ladies and gentlemen. My name is Alan Butler. I'm a librarian for Wexford Town Library, and thank you for joining us today to celebrate International Women's Day. I am delighted to introduce our guest for tonight. It's Ann Gallagher. Ann, you have a very impressive CV, may I say, for anyone that isn't aware of you. I have a few points highlighted here. So you're a qualified solicitor and barrister. You are a former lecturer of law and regulation of aquabusiness, a former senator. You were a spokesperson for Environment and Rural Affairs, for Justice, Equality and Law Reform, and you served in Joint Oireachtas Committee for Women's Rights and the Committee of Foreign Affairs, as well, no less, being a part of the Oireachtas All-Party Committee to review the Constitution and a full member of the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation. I also have noted that you were very active in local community groups, sports clubs and women's groups. So really, I mean, from a grassroots level to big national and international topics and top table conversations, you really have seen and done an awful lot throughout your career. And I suppose from a very unique female perspective as well. Yeah. So, and we're here today to celebrate just that. It's International Women's Day. And so maybe I could hand you over to maybe, I suppose, a big picture question to jump right in and talk about your history, I suppose, from a female perspective, the equality that you might have experienced or lack thereof, and where do you feel we are today with equality for women? I mean, not just professionally, socially, culturally. We'd love to hear your points on that.
Okay, Alan, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and good evening to everybody. I have a long CV, but that's only because I've lived long, managed to squeeze a lot in. And I suppose if you're looking at a CV, you might think, gosh, she was very strategic and had an idea as to what she was doing in life. I mean, it's totally the opposite. I fell into most things. And I often think if I were to do it again, I should have been more strategic, but I've had great experience and I don't regret a minute of it. And I think that's one good thing. In terms of where we are now, I often wonder, do we think, and certainly do younger people think we now have equality? I look at the fact that we are not a minority group, and yet looking at proportional representation in the Dáil and in public life generally, we haven't achieved that as women. You know, we still only have 22% of our TDs who are women. That's a very small percentage. We're ranked 96th in the world, you know, and we're below sub-Saharan African countries in terms of female representation. So we can't clap ourselves on the back in that respect. I remember growing up, I suppose I was born into a very traditional family, like most of us back then. My mother was a homemaker. And I suppose when I think about equality and discrimination, it's so ingrained in us. My mother had 3 girls, and there was always talk from other people as to when was she going to produce the boy that was needed to carry the family name. And so that is still a thing. You know, until we get past that, until we value our girl born as well as our boys born, you know, there is something strange about that, in the sense that maybe we should adopt the Jewish system where they have the matriarch line and follow the mother's line rather than the father's. But in any case, I think there are things like that growing up, you're gendered in terms of toys, you're gendered in terms of expectations, you're gendered in terms of class subjects. So it's very difficult to come out as a teenager and have a true sense of your value and your equality as a citizen, as a person. So I do think we've a lot to learn, and it's almost like a thing about citizenship. It's almost a thing for education, you know, that it's not something that women should have to keep fighting for and making us seem like we're belligerent and aggressive feminists. It should be something that we all value and want in our society. We shouldn't have to have that label that says, oh, she's a feminist, therefore she must be whatever. It's almost a damaging label. So I've always avoided it, and I feel I'm an equalist. I feel that I certainly try to treat everybody equally, regardless of gender or class or any other ethnicity or anything else. But I think that's not always easy for some people.
Oh,
And they may not always be aware of their own ingrained discriminatory views.
absolutely. I mean, and it speaks to the culture that you're even conscious of avoiding certain labels, that you won't be perceived a certain way. And I mean, that certainly has historically been the case, and I think so still today, as you say. Like if a man is outspoken and aggressive in business, he's seen as a real go-getter, but a woman might be seen as, like I said, an upstart, or some other kind of descriptor would be used for a female position.
I found that a lot in politics when I was a senator, and I'd make quite I suppose maybe a bolshy speech or whatever. I was deemed to be aggressive, whereas the man was assertive when he said much the same thing. Or he was serious when I was passionate. Passionate was a word that was often used, which is a slightly patronizing term, because it seems to say that I'm emotionally driven. The woman is emotionally driven as opposed to the rational thinking man. As opposed to being, I would have seen the passion in some women's attitude to achieving something as being something that was extremely worthwhile and valuable. So language is important, and how we label people, as you say, again, can be destructive or positive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there must have been huge frustration coming up through professional and social environments where that is the case, and you're trying to show your value, I guess, but at the same time you're aware of these unwritten rules, or these invisible ceilings that are there that you have to.
I remember when I first started working as a solicitor, and I was working in a rural firm, and the client would come into the office and he'd say, where's the boss? Where's the solicitor? On the assumption that I couldn't have been one. So, there was that, and you deal with these things to the point it doesn't matter, you don't care, but it still says something about expectations that are ingrained in a lot of people.
Absolutely, and I think it's something we spoke about in one of our earlier conversations off air, is that I'm very conscious of even how I'm asking these questions now, because I feel, coming from a very privileged or different perspective, I guess, that I've worked in public sector vast majority of my career, like in the library service. It's a very male dominated profession. Every county manager I've worked under has been female. So for me, it's quite natural to have a female manager. And I find it startling, when you compare it to private sector situations, or like you described there, where there's just the assumption that you're not going to be the boss because you're a woman.
Yeah, now that's some time ago, and I hope that's still not the case. But I do think there is something, it's an important point to make when we talk about equality in the workplace. It's assumed, we've got all these rights, and we know we've got these rights, paternity and maternity leave, and your rights to not work overtime, etc., etc. But in reality, if you look for your rights in the private sector, you tend to be a little bit of a troublemaker. And therefore it's frowned upon. Perhaps it may well affect your promotional prospects. It may well impact on how you might move in a small sector, specialist sector, where everybody knows everybody. And Ireland is a small market. So when I'm talking to people who are in the public sector, who are teachers, who can plan their pregnancies freely and know that it's not an issue to take leave and not have to worry about having your job when you come back. That's very different to my experience. And I recall so well, young female barristers almost tripping over themselves to get back to work quickly after having a child, because they had to hold on to their clients. If they weren't back, they're self-employed, if they weren't back at work, their clients were gone, and their clients were solicitors that they had worked with for many years. So in that sector, you can't avail of the so-called maternity leave that you've got. You have to be back at work. Something that occurred to me, and it may be a funny incident, but it's something I often thought about afterwards, was that I was self-employed as a solicitor when I was expecting my son, and he came a week early. And that day I had a scheduled appointment to fulfill somebody's mortgage, to get them their new house, the keys to their door, at 2 o'clock that day, for which they were totally excited. But I'd gone into labour earlier that morning. So I had the baby. Being the conscientious female worker that I am, I didn't take the bed in the hospital, came straight back to my office and was in my office at 2 o'clock, having had a baby just a few hours before. Baby came home with me, by the way. And the call came from the solicitor on the other side, a younger female solicitor. And she said, really crossly, she'd been ringing earlier that morning and I wasn't there to take the call. Where was I? Her client was waiting. She needed to get this sorted. And I said, I was having a baby. And she said, well, I don't care. I wanted this sorted. So there was that kind of, oh, instead of saying, wow, well done you. What are you doing here? Any empathy, sympathy, anything. And that was from my fellow female solicitor.
And I was just going to even come in with that point. I was expecting to have the opposite reaction, that there would have been more camaraderie and support from another female professor.
Now, I think years later, she had her own family and might, I hope, reflect on what was said at that time and realise that's not so easy. It's not so easy.
And so I'm wondering then, does that speak to I suppose a twofold question here. Does that speak to a disconnect between, say, the relationship between female co-workers, and does it speak maybe further to a disconnect between younger female workers compared to someone like yourself that had been in the profession a bit longer?
Yeah, I mean, they're two good questions. The first one in relation to your co-workers, I've had great experiences working with women, but I've equally had awful experiences working with women, and therefore I suppose we're like humans. There are good female bosses and there's bad female bosses, there's good male bosses and there's bad male bosses, but I do get a general sense that men are more supportive of each other, more accepting of mistakes made by each other. There's a little bit more camaraderie in that sense. Maybe it's because women find it harder to get to where they are, but they're not always open to supporting other women, or mentoring other women, or allowing for the difficulties that other women face. It's almost like, well, I came up here the hard way and you'll do the same. So there is I would say, a sense of a lack of the support and solidarity that if we did have, we'd be ruling the world.
I have no doubt. Absolutely.
I remember, for instance, when I was running for the general election, the first time I ran it, when I was a child, Alan. But in any case, I was the only female candidate in the field, apart from a lady who was running for the Natural Law Party, which wouldn't have been a major party at that time, or indeed since. And you would think if there was a female vote, I might have gotten that, but I didn't. I got votes, I did very well, but I was sixth in a 5-seater on my first run. But that's not the point. My point is that it didn't really matter. Where I would have voted, and I understand you would vote party first, but I'd always like to give a stroke to a female candidate of other parties. And I'd like to think that other women would do the same, but I don't know if they do.
Yeah, okay. That's a fascinating insight, and again, coming from a male perspective, is not something that I would have been, I suppose, aware with. You would, like I said previously, would assume the opposite, and maybe that is coming from a male point of view, as you said, that men are maybe more collaborative or supportive in certain situations. And this is something.
And I do think there's a different. When you're working with men, I think men are straighter talkers. Maybe it's just my view. I tend to be a straight talker, but I found it easier to work with men in that sense because you always knew where you stood. If they want, if they get annoyed with you, they get annoyed with you. Women can say something terrible and smile at the same time, so it can be rather confusing at times. There is that. You asked me earlier about younger women, and I do think that they have a sense of equality. That's brilliant. And they have a confidence that the older generation of women may not have had, and that too is for the good. But I do think they don't really appreciate that there is still discrimination until they hit that time-ticking decade or so where, it's career versus children. That period of your career is really problematic for women. And unless you've hit that and gone through it and experienced it and have developed empathy for other women, it's difficult to know. The younger woman feels that the world is her oyster. she may well experience difficulties later on when you have to make hard choices, because in reality, so many women, even today, have, you know, their partner saying, well, the cost of childcare versus the cost of your net income, you know, maybe you should consider staying at home. You know, the childcare cost is the woman's. You know, the tax is allowances with the man, the lesser is passed on to the woman. So there is that kind of, you know, that you've got to make choices, and they're harder choices. Nobody would say as easily to the man, consider staying at home, but it would be more readily said to the woman. So we continue to discriminate, and we continue to accept discrimination.
Sure.
And we don't even acknowledge it or see it.
Yeah, it just, as you're speaking there, kind of reminded me of the Oscar Wilde quote, you know, youth is wasted on the young. So they don't actually know the good position they're in until they reach the point where they have to start making those harder decisions.
Yes.
And I guess that's to one of the questions I was going to ask. It was, say, the pros and cons for the modern working woman. And I suppose you've addressed that there when you're saying they have the knowledge and the sense of the equality that's available to them. But then I guess the con is that they will still be dealing with similar hard questions down the line, like that you went through, and like every female employee before them was.
Fights, and there are hard choices to be made. And I think, you know, if we really wanted to tackle those, we'd have to have a different culture and a different way of viewing work-life balance, rather than just talking about it, actually supporting it. We'd need to stop as employers looking for, oh, the gap in your CV, whatever happened to you? You must have been in an asylum, that you weren't making progress on your life. You know, women in many stages of their life, and men should be allowed to also move sideways, take a step backwards, take some time out. And ultimately, it makes you a much more rounded and solid and mature individual for employing down the line. I think there's a slight ignorance of perception in terms of the employer, that they feel, oh, unless they've seen a straightforward progression up the ladder, you're doing something wrong. A more mature employer will look for the older person that has what, did you ever read a book called by Daniel Goleman called Emotional Intelligence?
No, I didn't. I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
It's brilliant, because he's really saying that the gifts of and the strengths and the pros of being emotionally intelligent are that you will truly listen, that you will hear and sense what the person isn't saying to you, that you will develop and promote proper supportive teamwork. Those people get things done. And I do think they are skill sets that are much more commonly found among women. And yet so much undervalued in the workplace and by employers.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, the idea of taking a step back from work for whatever reasons, it comes with a sense of fear.
Yeah, especially if you're in the private sector.
You down the line,
you could fall off the edge of
shown incompetence or. Yeah, exactly. And you're right, that's something that should be more embraced, for allowing for a more balanced lifestyle, and that you're coming back with different experiences, you're coming back refreshed, and as you spoke to again, a cultural change and about the proportion of female representation in government, I was thinking to some of the Scandinavian models where they're reducing their working hours. I haven't researched the country, so it's only coming to me as you speak. I can't remember if it was Finland or Denmark. I think it was Finland. Had a fully female government at one point. It's and again, it's a cultural thing there. That it seems to be viewed in an entirely different perspective. Gender doesn't seem to be as much of an issue. Taking a step back from work and the real life-work balance is seen as more of a priority than pushing yourself to the edge of what you can do within your profession.
Yeah, I think we have adopted the culture that is predominantly American and English in terms of, you know, work, fast, focus, career driven, all of that, and where we can do attitude. And we've also, while doing that, we still brought with us the old Irish tradition found in our constitution, and the guilt that comes with that about being the great mother in the home, and the availability, that almost the martyrdom that was expected of mothers of the old days, including my own mother, that you were, the more you could do for your children, the more you could give up, the better you were. So that, you know, we ended up taking the worst of both, instead of adopting a model like the culture that they have in Scandinavia. And it's not by any means perfect, but it certainly it seems that gender is not an issue at all there, and people are valued for their contribution to society. And I suppose it's a wider sense of citizenship. They also have something that I think we should consider, but it's fairly radical. They have a more open view to publishing salaries.
Okay.
And why do I mention that?
I wonder, is there an equality issue on salaries?
There's such pay discrimination, pay disparity in the private sector particularly, at least in the public sector again, you know what you're getting as a paid teacher, paid whatever, and your principal officer and da da da. In the private sector, I could be working with a fellow colleague for years and never know that he was getting 22% more than me every single year and every single day that I sat there. You know, there's something wrong about that. And in Scandinavia, they regularly publish in your income tax returns, everything's published. It's way more open and transparent. Whereas in Ireland, we think you'd be sued for telling that it's such private data. Yeah. So I think we should at least consider within organisations having a law that says we publish the range within which people are paid, and that a small enough range so that I'm not on 42 and you're on 49 and we're both in the same bracket. But something like that there's no point in having a law that says we don't have paid discrimination, which is the law since 1974 in Ireland, when we still do.
Yeah, it's hypocritical.
How do you address it? How do you address it in the private sector unless we publish salaries or salary ranges? So they're the big issues that still have to be addressed if we truly want equality in the workplace.
Again, you're dealing with deep-rooted cultural attitudes there as well, because I mean it's ingrained in, at least in rural Ireland. I know from money is like the last thing you would talk about.
And everybody's the bail buck, and you don't want anybody to know of your wealth or not. But we have to get over that if we really want to say, this is what I'm earning, this is what I'm worth, this is what I deserve, and it's within the same range as my male colleague sitting beside me.
Absolutely, yeah.
What's wrong with that?
No, nothing at all. And it just, I suppose another question I was going to ask you, but I suppose we're kind of leaning to it already here, is if you were starting off today, if you were a young politician today or a young professional today, do you think the next 20, 30 years that your career would have gone in a very different direction? But it seems from what we're saying that you're starting off perhaps from a better point in theory, but the same deep-rooted issues are still there.
And I think that's the difficulty. I think the younger me would have more confidence. I think the younger me would hopefully be more strategic than I ever was. I fell into jobs. I ran for the Senate on a whim. I did law on a whim. You know, it was no big plan. But I think, yes, it should be easier, and it probably is easier for women, and mostly nowadays because they just won't sit at home and they won't take it. But on the other hand, they will still be up against the fact that at a certain stage of their lives, they are expected to be the predominant carer in the home. They're often called upon to be the carers of their own parents, you know, and they're often expected to sacrifice themselves and their money and not take the promotion, etc., so that they're not under so much pressure in terms of the son who's doing the leaving cert, etc., etc. So there's a lot of the sacrifices are expected for the woman, and the woman supports the male on the other hand to go. I would say in a simple way, I often think that men overachieve and women underachieve for exactly the same reasons.
Yeah.
And I think that's a reality. I also would like to say, Alan, you know, when we talk about equality, there's our constitution. And since 1937, of course, it was drafted by men, Eamon de Valera and Archbishop McQuaid, but it says in it, you know, that they value the women's contribution in the home. Let me see, recognises, but by her life within the home, woman gives to the state a support without which the common good cannot be achieved. So we're valuable in the home, but now we're expected to be in the home, and we're expected to be outside the home, and we're expected to be brilliant wives, mothers, cooks, chefs, the whole lot. And on the second page, it says that the state is going to endeavour to ensure that mothers shall not be obliged by economic necessity to engage in labour, to the neglect of their duties in the home. So this is 2021.
Yeah.
And we are still being told in the Constitution that, okay, if we're forced to work for economic reasons, so be it, but we can't neglect our duties in the home. Now, why hasn't that been changed by somebody? And I really think, you know, when it comes to problems in society and radical changes, you know, why don't we improve our healthcare system? If we had more rushing short hauls and more Catherine Martins and more Regina Dohertys and more Mary Lou McDonalds, and I'm saying them deliberately, of all the parties, Maria Sherlock, those politicians, I think we'd be a lot further on. So I do think a lot of the problems that we end up dealing with in reality, in practice, in our everyday lives, could be supported and changed by those at the top. And it doesn't get done because I don't think they're recognised by the politicians, and I think there aren't enough women there to see it and to gender-proof all our policies. Absolutely. To make sure that when they bring in something, that it doesn't disadvantage women or discourage them from looking for that promotion.
Absolutely. And I suppose we started off on such a big, broad question of where equality is today. If we'll come back around and we'll start wrapping up with an equally broad question, and you're touching on it there. What are the solutions then? If, like, what would you do yourself? What would you like to see happen to bring forward this type of equality that is clearly necessary and clearly lacking?
Yeah, I would like to see more women in decision making, and that means, you know, in actual power. I know brilliant women in every town, village around Ireland who get things done. They're doers, they just get it sorted, problem solvers, used to multitasking and all of that, really. Why aren't these people harnessed into doing something that can be achievable for us in our generation? They have to be brought into decision making. So that means at least 50% of the politicians, TDs, councillors should be women. That's a given, because if you want proportional representation, that's proportionate to our population. That's a given, that should be there. We should have more women involved in business. And I find that women are brilliant entrepreneurs because they're problem solvers. Not any better, maybe not any different to men. But I do think that they need to be supported, more supports in the private sector. I do think we need to have more work-life balance. So why not seriously consider a 4-day week? Men would benefit from it, children would benefit from it, and women would benefit from it. It would help to achieve a better work-life balance. And as an employer, and I have been an employer, the day that they're off is the day that they do their dentist and their appointments and everything. So you're not missing out on anything. And you're getting somebody who's ready to work and committed to their job when they come into work. And I think everybody would be happier. I don't think it would be an economic downturn or any. I think it would be very positive in the economy. I had written a few other things. I often wondered about the longer school year. It seems to be a bit of a headache for so many women that they have to juggle during those school holidays that are exceptionally long in Ireland. I do think we need state childcare. That it shouldn't be, you know, private and local charities and granny and favours and swaps, and, you know, that it should be state, as it is in the Scandinavian countries. They're right adjacent to the primary school automatically. State run, state paid for, well looked after employees doing very good work looking after our children. That should be a given, you know. And then we need some more education in relation to what is it to be a citizen and how can we support each other and have a society rather than an economy. Maybe we'd all benefit from that. So it's not me being sexist, it's about us all having a better life, a better work-life balance.
Oh, absolutely. And I have to say I couldn't agree more with those points, and it does seem like obvious and win-win solutions, but time will tell how many of them will get implemented. Hopefully all.
Yeah, I'm already grey, but I was going to say when I'm old and grey, I'd live to see it. But it does remind me we've made so many improvements over the years, and I was one of the TDs, senators at the time, in relation to divorce coming in. So I worked with Mervyn Taylor, who brought in the first Divorce Act at that time in 1994, and since that there have been huge achievements. But I think we can still do better, and it's for the benefit of everybody in society.
Yes, absolutely. A lot done, but a lot more to do.
Oh, that sounds a bit like a political slogan.
I won't change profession. I'll leave that.
But it's true. It's absolutely true. Yeah.
Absolutely. Look, Anne, it was an absolute pleasure speaking to you today. I could literally talk to you for the rest of the evening. Perhaps we can get you on for another conversation in the future. But thank you so much for your time today. It's really been fascinating, illuminating conversation. For everyone that's watching, if you're on the Facebook premiere or on the YouTube channel, feel free to like, share, and put a comment there and start a conversation of your own about what you think needs to be done. Thank you very much for joining us, and keep an eye on our social media platforms for future postings. Thank you.
And thank you, Alan, for your time and for talking to me. And it was great to get some COVID-free conversation.
That's been needed.
Take care.
Thanks very much, Anne.